turn things around. If we don't reduce emissions now and over the long term, the consequences will be profound, widespread, and devastating. It can't be tackled by one government, one trading bloc, or one part of the world. Climate change is the most significant challenge humanity has ever faced. Addressing it will take all parts of society, public and private sector. I know that this year is not the easiest one to address multiple global challenges, but we have no other choice. Climate change won't wait for us to be in a better position to address it. It's here, it's getting worse, and we must deal with it. Are budgets throughout the world stretched? Of course they are. Are we tired of hearing doom and gloom scenarios? Of course we are. So let's talk about opportunity. We actually stand at a unique moment in human history. I challenge you to look through the history books and show me where humanity has been in a better position to change so much so quickly and on a global scale. It has never been done. But I am convinced that we can do it. If we can emerge from the current crisis and make a green recovery, we are going to not only make the future greener, cleaner, and healthier for our children, but we are going to create more jobs, better jobs, in the here and now. A recent report by IRENA shows that embracing renewable energy for global energy needs could push jobs in the renewable sector to 42 million by 2050. That this could result in a GDP growth of 2.4%, a gain of 98 US trillion by mid-century. That's just renewable energy, one sector. So when we talk about addressing climate change, we should not be using the terms like burden or cost. We should speak about opportunity, growth, profit, jobs, well-being. The race to a greener planet, the race to a cleaner planet, the race to zero is about opportunity. So as we work to recover from personal and economic losses, and as we build forward from COVID-19, let's capture that opportunity by putting climate action at the forefront of everything we do. This is our chance, and let me say, our obligation for individuals, industries, and governments, for all of us, to make the necessary decisions today. Decisions that will have both immediate and long-term impacts. The Race to Zero campaign is part of that work, rooted in the present with an eye to long-term climate results. It is inclusive, ambitious, and is gaining momentum. Let's bring this momentum to the upcoming G7 meetings and ultimately to COP26, where all nations and all actors must achieve results, where we must achieve success. Success means fulfilling past commitments and promises. This is vital. What we're really talking about is trust. The public hears a lot about promises related to climate change. Now they're hearing about 2030, 2040, 2050, and all of that is extremely important. But how can we expect everyday people to accept long-term plans if nations still haven't done what they have promised under the Paris Agreement? Promises such as moving the agreement from adoption to implementation. Promises such as completing work on issues related to carbon markets and pricing. Promises such as submitting strong, robust, and ambitious climate action plans known as NDCs. Promises such as mobilizing 100 billion in funding support to developing nations. Providing support to developing countries is indispensable to ensure that all countries and all actors can contribute to keep the 1.5-degree goal within reach. And to back up the ambition of governments, the private sector needs to contribute solutions, business models, and financing models that respond to the specific needs of each country. Climate change action cannot move forward if we do not have the trust that all these promises will be kept. And trust means putting action behind words. This is true for businesses and for governments. Commitments under the Race to Zero must result in action. Dear friends, as business leaders, you know the importance of having both a strategic plan and a business plan, of thinking about both short term and long term goals. It's time to incorporate this thinking in our climate work. Government, businesses, all of us in our daily lives as well. I want to thank you for your commitment. I want to thank you for your climate action, and I look forward to both the immediate and the long term results. Thank you. Over to you, Tony.
Well, thank you, Patricia, and what incredible start really to our B7 climate summit. Fantastic political contributions from both Alok and Patricia. But now we're going to move on to hear business contributions. I noted that Patricia talked about we need business to bring solutions, business models, and finance models. And so that's why we've got the panel we have assembled. First of all, we have Alison Rose, the CEO of the NatWest Group. We have Alistair Dormer, Vice President and Chief Environment Officer at Hitachi. We have Francesco Starace, the CEO and General Manager of Enel. Dave Prisano, Managing Director at HP. Pierre-André de Chalendar, the CEO of Saint-Gobain. Welcome, all of you. And I hope you could pick up the contributions from Patricia and also from Alok. I'm going to sort of come to you with a pretty easy opening question, really, which is, you know, what motivated you to get involved in the Race to Zero, and what are you focusing on right now? And Alison, I wonder if I might come to you first.
Thank you. And thank you for asking me to join today's panel. I'm really delighted to be here. Very simply, the need to get involved in this was critical. Tackling climate change, I think, is one of the most important issues generationally we are going to face, and is going to be critical for defining the future. And for me, that's why I made it a core part of our strategy for NatWest Group when I took over last year. I think also it's critical that customers, investors, and other stakeholders expect us to deliver on our climate promises and our challenges, because this, above anything, is going to require massive collaboration globally across public and private sectors, and individually as we try and help assist everyone make this transition to a low carbon economy. So very simply, what have we been doing? Well, we recognize this isn't a challenge we can address on our own, but it's also critically important that we get started even before we have all the answers. So we've made some very bold commitments, it threefold. Firstly, getting our own house in order. I think it's important as a large corporate we address our issues. So we are already net zero with regard to our own operations and are targeting to be net positive by 2025. Secondly, ending harmful activities. So we have been focused to different sectors which cause harm, and also working with those sectors where we can help them transition. So we have committed working to phase out the financing of coal, but also reducing our emissions across our own balance sheet. And finally, the third area is helping the gen, and I think this is a really important aspect. We all need to work together to make sure we can transition the economy. As a bank, we provide financing, so we've made a commitment to halve the impact of our financing or impact of our balance sheet by 2030. And that means working with customers and small to help them transition. Just withdrawing from different sectors won't necessarily solve the problem. It will potentially lead to massive dislocation. And so transition is the area that we are very, very focused on, as well as the other two of our own house in order and ending harmful emissions. For me, leading bank to small businesses, what I'm really focused on is making sure we can put the tools and the information in the hands of our customers to help them make good choices. And let me give you an example. We know that 88% of businesses want to reduce emissions in their supply chain, but don't know how to. So access to data and tools is important. So we're collaborating with companies like Microsoft to build AI-based tools to help companies, particularly SMEs, measure their emissions and therefore be able to make the transition. Launching residential mortgages to help people make good choices about their mortgages and green mortgages. But the scale of the problem is very significant, which comes back to, I think, what is the most important point. We will not be able to solve this problem individually as CEOs of businesses, or it does need a collective action. It's not a competitive sport, it's one where we'll need to work together. And therefore, that's where I think policy shapers here, not policy takers. And our role in COP26 as the main banking sponsor means we're a key part of that debate of bringing those decisions together and hopefully helping not just the big agenda, but also small customers and individuals to make good choices. So no ask, very big ambitions. I think importantly, setting ambitious goals and starting on the path as we need to move forward.
Alison, thank you. And before I bring in Alistair, just one question I'd like to ask you, which I'll ask all the panel as well, which is, being pretty pragmatic about this, what do you see as the biggest barriers for you in the journey you're on, and how are you working to overcome them?
So I think the biggest barriers are really in having consistent measurement and data for our own operations. As I've said, we're already there on the net zero commitment, but I think putting the data and having a common set of measurements and methodology is really important, and that's where we'll need collaboration. And then secondly, I think that the biggest barrier is then helping transition. So let me give you an example. The residential housing market, UK housing stock, is really complex. The supply chain is really complex. On that a little earlier, having the data to understand where the issues are so that we can then measure them and then transition them, I think is important. Financing them, we can do that, we can help that. New technologies are coming online, but consistent data, consistent approach, collaboration, and comms, I think, are going to be the key barrier.
That's great, thank you. And I do want to come back later in the session to this question of financing transition. But Alistair, changing sectors radically. If I can come on to you, Alistair, and the folks at Hitachi. So what's convinced you to get on this race to zero, and what are you working on?
Well, thanks, Tony. I mean, firstly, let me just say, the race to zero is so important for Hitachi, because having that sort of clear, auditable sustainability strategy is a must for any global enterprise. We're seeing pressure from society, from our staff, from investors, from our customers to decarbonize. So it's incredibly important that we step up to the plate and deliver on those commitments. But it's not just about what we're doing ourselves. Also, it's what role we can do for society, considering the amount of technology that a corporation like Hitachi produces. So it's really also about our own credibility, because we think we've got a major role to play in decarbonisation, working across our 5 key sectors, which are mobility, energy, industry, automotive, and the digital sectors. We've committed to carbon neutrality by 2030 for our global operations, and we will invest around $850 million over the next 10 years to decarbonise. But it's not just us. Our procurement organisation are also now actively working with our top 70% by value in the supply chain for them to commit to sustainability, which is an enormous a global effort. And I think, the race to zero, what it does is it is the gold standard, as Alok said, and it's a very high barrier and a tough barrier for us to reach. So it's an incredibly important thing for us to be able to demonstrate and have that accreditation. But looking at the big picture, we see a multiple of government announcements to tackle climate change is a real positive for business. We've seen the big commitments in the last year announced in Japan, in China, Europe, the UK, and now the US, making huge investments in renewable energy and policies to move away from fossil fuel. I mean, this will dramatically change things. It will dramatically change energy generation and distribution with huge increases in energy forecasted. And with renewable energy becoming the dominant source of energy, this introduces an additional complexity of less stable supply and demand balancing. So we need smarter systems and technology to manage these complex situations. So in our energy business, Hitachi ABB Power Grids, we're really working at the forefront of this challenge to electrify. I mean, from distributing solar energy in Africa to connecting offshore wind in the UK and China, linking the grids in Norway and Germany, UK and France, providing intelligent infrastructure for Britain's railways, e-bus networks in India, serving industry, providing high voltage networks, substations for data centers and secure energy in the Middle East. We're very busy. But we can do more. Now, whilst the investment in energy will be significant, the transition from predominantly fossil fuel mobility sector to electric will require perhaps 4 times the level of investment required for the energy sector, which is absolutely huge. And Hitachi is a major player in the rail industry, as many people in the UK are now aware after some problems this weekend. But we are committed to sustainable transport and are developing battery trains with a UK partner, developing hydrogen trains with Toyota. And in the automotive sector, we are a big supplier to all of the world's top OEMs for motors and inverters. And our business is predicting a real explosion in electric vehicles with compound annual growth rates of over 27% over the next 5 years. So the partnership for government's important. I mean, we're working with the UK government as a digital partner on a program called Optimise Prime. This is working with companies such as Royal Mail, British Gas, Centrica, and Uber. And the work is to fully understand how to manage big fleets of electric vehicles and optimize it within the constraints of battery range, vehicle operation, ultimately, battery life, vehicle residual value, and demands on the grid. I mean, this is a fantastic harvest of data and has added to the experience we have gained from our renewable energy management and battery energy storage projects in the Isles of Scilly in the UK and in Hawaii over the last 5 years.
Right.
So we see this as a great opportunity for business and governments to work in partnership to deliver this important transformation. Green technology times digital is a real engine for growth. So this is an exciting time to help cities, governments, and companies cut carbon and accelerate our potential as Hitachi as a climate change innovator.
Yeah.
So, going forward, we need governments and municipalities to develop the right funding model, correctly apportion the risk where it can best be managed. But I have no doubt that the private sector will step up to partner good projects for green infrastructure, which will enable companies like Hitachi to deliver the future sustainable world that we all desire.
Alistair, thank you. A pretty comprehensive, I mean, the business is so far reaching, isn't it? You've given us a pretty comprehensive view of not only what you're doing, but where some of the biggest challenges are. Thank you for that. Francesco, I'd like to come to you now at Enel. Again, what's motivated you to join the Race to Zero, and what are the big priorities for you guys?
Thank you. Well, actually, we found ourselves already in the race. So we're happy that it started too. I mean, we saw this coming about 10 years ago in 2010 when we started Enel Green Power, and we had a view that the renewable energy business was going to become a very large, fiercely competitive, and global business. So we started decarbonizing our large generating fleet at that time. And I have to say, it was a time where it was not so obvious that what Patricia just said and what also Alok Sharma just said, you know, that renewable energy would be cheaper than not just new coal gas facilities, but existing coal and gas facilities. At that time was not obvious. So we found ourselves doing that, and along the way we understood we were in the right track and kept accelerating. Today we have the largest renewable generating fleet, privately owned, and we are also the largest player in terms of growth year after year. But that said, just in 2019 we broke the time in which renewable generation in terms of capacity and energy generated surpassed the thermal generation portion that we still have. And we made a pledge to, to have a SBTi science-based target aligned with global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees by 2030 for the first in the industry. I think other companies now in the sector are going to follow that. But our view was that at that time, it still is, that the race to zero has a very limited time to achieve success. And here I think what Patricia said is extremely important. Time is very, very important in this case. I believe that what we have done has had success. You know, the growth of the company, the valuation of the company, and the success of the company largely depended on that choice that we took about 10 years ago, and also in the fact that we embedded the SDG principles and the Sustainable Development Goal targets in our strategy and in all our operating processes. Now the whole company is moving towards 4 basic SDG targets, number 7, number 9, 11, and 13, being 13 climate change. I think that what we've heard today is extremely important from the UK government. We're moving from some ambiguity that existed in the past to some clear signals. We're moving from low carbon to no carbon. We are moving from well below 2 degrees to below 1.5. We're moving from, like I said, renewables cheaper than new coal and gas to renewables cheaper than existing coal and gas. And we're looking at a government that says to business, please push us, please show us that you are happy if we go in that direction. And I think the business is responding quite clearly, you know, with the big participation today in this race, that yes, that's right. Please keep pushing. And we will be standing by you and prodding you to really push this forward. I mean, this is a time in which we have to focus on 10 years.
Yep.
With existing technologies. We know exactly what to do. We don't need to have some kind of spaceship from Mars bringing us a technology we don't have. We have the technology. We now just have to deploy it with decisiveness and without ambiguity, while working at things that will help us further decarbonize after 2030. And here we have to make sure that we separate clearly what is today's task. And when I say today, I mean the next 10 years, and tomorrow's task, which is what happens after 2030. Yeah. We as a company are committing to 2030, and we have also big commitment to be completely carbon neutral by 2050. I think we will get there earlier.
Francesco, thank you for that account. It's interesting to me that you started pretty early on your own
Mhm.
race. Maybe you can give us some advice. What are the hardest things to confront on this journey? What are the major barriers you've faced? And what do you think the breakthroughs were on your own journey?
I think the most let's say the most subtle traps are those that have to do with the word neutrality, because there is a positive nuance about being neutral. Neutral means nice. It means not hostile, but it also means that you don't take your position and that you don't know where to go. And I think you have to give away the fact that this carbon neutrality, or let's say technological neutrality, is something that hinders you in your progress, because you have a legacy, and the legacy is actually the problem. So you have to detach yourself from your legacy, which is not easy. I think that was the most difficult thing that we had to do. Don't be neutral on everything, because it's a mistake.
Thank you. That's a great phrase, isn't it? Detach yourself from your legacy. Thank you for that. Dave, let's move on to you at HP. It would be great to hear your thoughts about why you've got involved and what is it you're doing right now and in the months to come.
Well, thanks very much, Tony, and it's great to be here talking about this important topic. I think for us getting in, I mean, it's impossible to ignore what's going on, and we've heard from the UN about climate change being an existential threat to humanity. And if we look at the science, and if we don't limit the warming to 1.5 degrees, we'll face big changes in temperature that affect really our livelihoods. And we see marginalized groups probably experiencing a disproportionate impact from climate change, which is kind of a compounding problem. HP has really been a long time leader in our industry in terms of climate action. We were the first company to publish our carbon footprint, and as well to set a comprehensive emissions reduction goals publicly. We did this in 2017. But I think, like the other speakers you've heard from today, we recognize the urgency of the next decade to go further to address climate change. And that's why we're committed on this journey toward net zero emissions actually by 2040, which is 10 years ahead of the UN's net zero goal. I think the other thing for us and important to consider is that I think from this point forward, companies and brands are judged by more than the profits that they generate. Those are important, but they're also measured by the value that they create for society as a whole. And I can tell you that HP aspires to be the world's most sustainable and just technology company. And I think Allison talked about this, but two big steps for us: one internal, one external. First is definitely getting our house in order. I love how she put that. It's ensuring that we're doing all that we can to make our operations sustainable. For HP, that's focusing in three key areas: carbon emissions, circularity, and forests. So, and taking carbon emissions as an example, we've really built a roadmap that says, how do we get to that net zero by 2040? And it starts with being carbon neutral in our operations by 2025, being carbon neutral in our print supplies business by 2030, committing to that 50% reduction of emissions by 2030 as well, and ultimately reaching that net zero goal of 2040. I think the second thing is looking externally and using our scale and purchasing power and influence to change the ecosystem of suppliers and partners that we have out there. And this really allows us to kind of magnify and multiply, I should say, the change that we can deliver at scale really globally. And so for us, and I think you've heard this as well, it's not just the right thing to do, it's also really good for business. Over the last 2 years, HP's been tracking the amount of business that we've won where sustainability is a known criteria. So when a company comes out with a tender and they've indicated that sustainability was important to them, and we've won over $1 billion per year over the last 2 years as a result of that. So we're really proud of the progress that we've made. We made a lot of, we can talk about this later perhaps, but a lot of big commitments as part of Earth Day last month. But we know that there's lots more work to do, and that's why discussions like this are so important.
Thanks, Dave. What's the hardest bit? So, of everything you've done, what's the thing that's been most challenging, and how have you overcome the barriers?
I think for us, it's really, I think, and I may sound a little bit like a broken record, but it's really, first of all, it's being very public about your carbon emission reduction goals, and so across the business, and actually getting started in an immeasurable way. So we were among the first companies with reduction goals that were actually approved by the Science Based Targets Initiative. So it's being public about that. It's actually measuring those targets, and I think the other things that we've done really in terms of our commitments, we're committing to use 60% renewable electricity in our operations by 2025, 100% by 2035. And then we're also making big commitments through facility energy efficiency projects and site optimization work, renewable electricity use, as I mentioned, and actually transitioning to electric vehicles and low emission vehicles in our HP fleet. So it's really, I would say, being public, measurable, and then taking the steps right now.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Dave. We'll come back to you in a moment. Pierre-Andre, it would be great to hear, again, a very different sector at Saint-Gobain. It would be very good to hear your story. Why have you got involved? And what are you doing? What's the big priorities and projects?
Well, first of all, Tony, I'd like to thank you for this great initiative the CBI is taking. And it reminds me of the preparation of COP21 in Paris. I happened to be at that time, as it was in Paris, organizing what was, I think, the first business climate summit. And what a change in the last 6 years. I think business, it was the first time government was asking business to participate, and now government is really considering business is key, which is a big progress, and we are working hand to hand. Saint-Gobain is a major contributor to this topic, and that's why also after this in 2015 I wrote a book about that, the experience of COP21. Our business model and is based around providing solutions to help building and construction decarbonize for the consumers when they are in the buildings. And building and construction is a major part of the energy related greenhouse emission in the world, more than 30%, in many areas around 40%. To give you an example, a Saint-Gobain double glazing, once it is installed, in 3 months, it saves the CO2 or the energy that it has taken to be produced. So we're, like Patricia was saying, we are a big solution provider. But at the same time, we are also a significant emitter, because to produce these goods, we are very intensive in energy. And we decided to work very early on. In the last decade, for instance, we have reduced by more than 40% our absolute Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. And it's not small numbers, from 18 million tons to 10 million tons in 2020. But it's not enough. And in September 19, we decided to go to zero net emission by 2050, joining the Business Ambition for 1.5 degrees campaign. And since then, we have worked hard to develop our roadmap with 2030 objectives, which are being validated by the Science-Based Target initiatives. And I think this new journey we have started is a key milestone. And my comments is that it's not necessarily easy, but the fact that we have taken these commitments very strong has mobilized the overall company. We have had to use tools. Early on, we had internal price of carbon. We are incentivize our managers on that. And I have committed to that Saint-Gobain will spend around 100 million euro per year on that. And the fact that we said we will spend this money is has a heavy impact on the mobilization of all employees within Saint-Gobain. So I think it's for us it was natural given our business model. Still, decarbonizing our own footprint is not easy, but I think it's a very good business decision, and I encourage those who have not taken those steps to go for it.
Well, thank you for that encouragement. You said a couple of times it's not easy. What's the hardest bit?
Well, probably the hardest bit initially is that you have many people who are in charge of P&Ls. And if you ask them to reduce their energy intensity, it's going to cost. Their capex is going so you need really to change that. And I have seen the two strongest and great help for that, in addition to the tools we have put internally, is both the fact that our investors and the financial community has a major role to play, is pushing us in that direction. And second, it's our employees, and especially I would say the young employees. So, you know what happened is that initially I was a little bit alone, progressively joined by the young employees, and now progressively everybody has come on board because they have realized that it's the only way forward.
You're like a COP veteran. You're the stories from COP21 and all your young employees are catching up with you. Well, I do want to come back to this question of financing and the right business case. Just before I do, just taking stock a little bit, I've just been taking a note of sort of the opportunities and the barriers, and just to play some of them back, there's a clear sense that we're at a tipping point now. I mean, all of you are talking in ways that I don't think probably at COP21 people were talking with such sort of advanced commitment and plans. Secondly, you're seeing real economic opportunity. You're seeing, platforms for growth. Thirdly, I really like that point about clear signals. Low carbon to no carbon, renewables cheaper than existing coal and gas. And we also talked about ESG pressure and the sort of corporate reputation piece. Of course, quite considerable barriers, getting the right data, Alison talked about, just the sheer scale of transition. Investment, and I really like every business person who's watching this will absolutely relate to the P&L owner that doesn't want extra capex associated with them. And I really like this phrase, distance from your legacy, creating distance from your legacy. So this is, lots of good signals, but also this stuff is still pretty hard. I'm really interested in talking about money and the business case for this, because we all know the social case, we know the planetary case, but I'd be really good to hear your thoughts, all of you, on the business case for this. Does it really stack up? And in particular, how you access finance for this. Alison, I'll give you a heads up. We'll come to you at the end to talking about access to finance, but I am interested in the business case. So maybe, Alistair, we could come to you. Does the business case stack up? I mean, does this make money, or is this just, frankly, you have no choice?
Yeah, I think it's both. I mean, if you look at the performance of companies that have a strong ESG rating over the last 5 years, their share prices consistently outperformed companies that have got a poor ESG rating. So I think there is a risk associated with this that is being priced in by investors, and therefore, most companies have got to manage that risk. But going back to the point that was made earlier, there is a cost to decarbonize, and I think what all businesses need to do to evaluate that capex is we need to incentivize our management and our leaders and our P&L owners in both our normal way of financial incentives, but also incentivized around ESG performance, because ultimately this will drive together. From my point of view, I'm absolutely convinced that companies that are driving in the race to zero will come out on top.
Can I push you a bit further on that? It's a really interesting set of points you made. I'm interested in the balance sheet of the race to zero. So the costs you can add up, the costs of decarbonisation, the capex, the P&L hit. The idea that the ESG benefit is somehow factored into the share price. So can you keep a running sort of total of the benefits? I can see that you can add up the costs, but are the revenues or the share price benefits pretty evident as well? And sort of, do you keep them in tally to make sure there's good ROI in this?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, and I think all businesses are struggling with that slightly. And the ultimate end game in this is to have a realistic carbon trading scheme, which is global, which has got CO2 priced at the right level. Because when we talk about risk, all investors are looking at company performance and saying, well, ultimately, if you don't decarbonize, you're going to have to buy carbon credits. And those carbon credits are just a waste of money, ultimately, at the end of the day. So the challenge for us is to decarbonize at the right rate, at the right cost, so that we don't have to wash money away in carbon credits.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Francesco, can we talk about can we talk business here? Does this add up from a business point of view? I mean, in a way, you have no choice, and we know it's right for the planet. But is there real money in this stuff?
There's a lot of real money in this stuff, and I think we are a testimony of that. You know, we are today the largest market cap in the utility space, and our market cap went up 3 times. I mean, this is just a plastic resemblant picture of what this does to a company. But practically, you can see this in 3 different ways. You know, you can look at it from cost competitiveness standpoint and say, if it is true as it is, that there are an increasing number of places around the world where the marginal cost of generating electricity from a new renewable energy plant beats the marginal cost of generating from an existing thermal infrastructure, you don't have any choice. I mean, you better do it to yourself before somebody else does it to you. So this is a number one no-brainer. The other one, if you want, is that you know, if you look at the broader picture on the sustainability ESG profile, then you can say this is something that helps me to avoid mistakes. Is it a tool that I can use to sieve those investments that make no sense and become less prone to make the same mistakes I've made over the past decades? The answer is yes, it does. In fact, when we started this journey, we took a very strange decision at the very beginning. At midway, I would say this was 2014. We said we will stop investing in anything that will take more than 3 years to be finished, to be built, which means that something that we start to do today must end before 3 years are elapsed. And that why? Because technology evolves so quickly that by the time you finish something that would take longer than that, your risk to having a different world in which your investment finally completed lands is high. So there is a risk profile that needs to be taken off the industry. Yeah. And to do that, we took this decision. And that was a big decision because most of the utilities at that time were still working with a 10 years time horizon. You know, large plants take a long time and permitting goes forever. But doing that required also a big focus on many small investments, a very granular way of growing, which became more flexible, less risky, extremely, I mean, it had the only negative that the quality of life of management deteriorated sensibly. But apart from that, the business case for the company became very large. Today, we invest about 10 billions every year, okay? But there is nothing that we do which will not end in more than 2 years. So you can imagine the flexibility of capital allocation we earned taking that decision. But that decision was taken to make the company less risky, more sustainable. So there is an incredible value in this direction.
It's a very interesting idea you've just raised. It's the kind of long-term value in short-term investment cycles, which is, I feel like that's a very, very challenging notion for the way most people think about their businesses at the moment. Dave, can I come on to you? HP, a hugely successful, incredibly well-managed global company. Is there a business case for this stuff?
Yeah, there is a business case here, Tony, for sure. I don't think, you know, the first part of your question about accessing financing isn't necessarily a big issue for HP given our size, but I think the really for us, this focus on cost mitigation is critical, and it's really, as I talked about, driving collaboration across our sector and to really rapidly decarbonize our supply chain, and also internally for us to work on product standards. How do we design, you know, that, I mean, our supply chain helps with the how things get built, but we define what gets built and using what materials. And so our designers are thinking through those things in terms of how do I leverage more, different kinds of products and materials to drive lower cost and better reuse, recycling, et cetera. I think the other thing that I talked about earlier, Tony, in terms of the business case, is that we definitely see this. I mean, as I said, we're tracking at $2 billion in sales, where sustainability was a critical element in the deal value proposition over the last 2 years. We're definitely seeing large enterprise companies and as well as governmental entities, public sectors, leveraging their buying power to drive to help their suppliers, help them use their suppliers to be more sustainable. So it's a little bit, if you're not in this, you may be left out of large enterprise and government sector deals.
And Dave, you raised supply chains. I'm wondering, this feels like something that a company of your scale can try and get right, but of course you need to roll this out through the supply chain or demand more from the supply chain. Has that been easy to do, or has that been hard?
I think it actually goes back to something that Patricia talked about for us, which it's part of this is actually changing your business model too. And so one of the things that we're doing relative to our supply chain is changing our business model in terms of moving away from the selling of products per se and more selling services, actually. So we're accelerating print and compute as a service type offerings, because now we can manage the entire life cycle of the products that are out there, how the services get delivered. It's a great way for us to bring those products back and overall reduce our carbon footprint. So I think I talked about using sustainable materials, pushing our supply chain around decarbonization. So yeah, there are definitely steps that can be taken here.
Pierre-Andre, maybe I can come on to you and start first with this question of the supply chain. Is it straightforward to bring the supply chain on board, or has that been tough?
No, it's not easy because especially in the construction industry, you have a lot of participants in the supply chain. So we have taken commitments about what we call our scope 3, but we need to engage our customers, our suppliers. So it's not easy. But I think we are getting there. And to take your question on the business case, I think for me, in addition to what has been said, and I think Francesco is in terms of the market cap is probably the best example, but I think you have the cost of not doing it is higher than the cost of doing it. Whether you talk about attractiveness for your as an employer brand, whether you take about reward from the shareholders, so I think that the cost of not doing anything is much higher than the cost of engaging into that direction. And that means that on the supply chain, we need to engage all the people working around us and to convince them that there is a higher cost if they don't go in that direction.
Well, look, before I come to Alison on some of the investment and financing issues, Pierre-Andre, what has your approach to financing this been? Has the company been sort of has it been well within its ambitions, well within its resources, or have you had to struggle to get finance and external finance support?
No, we have had no issue, and I can tell you when I said 3 months ago that we were going to add 100 million per year to our capex, there was no issue. At the last roadshow I had on the results, that's very interesting compared to 5-6 years ago. This year, and it's growing exponentially. This year, about 30 to 40% of my time was answering questions on these topics, on the ESG topics, versus just on our financial results. So I think the financing world is moving in that direction very fast at the moment.
Well, look, Pierre-Andre, and to all the panel, I'm going to ask you, after Alison and I have talked about finance, I'm going to ask you all about your aspiration for COP26. And so just to give you that warning. Alison, we've been talking a little bit about finance, and two things seem to be true if I get this right. Number one is this is expensive, but number two, actually there's financial rewards, there's a financial case, and people are accessing finance. Is that a fair characterization, or is that terribly simplistic?
Well, I think it's a bit of both, to be honest. But Look, there is an enormous opportunity here. The risk of not doing anything, I think, is very significant, and I think there is both the risk of what it presents on, companies' balance sheets and society as a whole. There's an enormous risk, and I think that argument is very clear, and we need to do something. But I think the opportunity enormous. So financing the transition and what needs to happen. We know, for example, in the UK, low carbon investment each year will have to increase from around 10 billion in 2020 to around 50 billion in 2030. So there is a huge amount of investment going in to finance at this transition to mitigate that sit there. So I think the opportunity is on the financing side, and the ability to transition. You're going to create more sustainable businesses. The access to that financing is there. Investors are looking, as just mentioned, are looking for more insight and more evidence that your balance sheet has been transitioned. If I look at our own financing on renewables, I set a target to get to 20 billion of renewable financing by 2022. We already hit 12 billion by the end of last year. That is good, profitable business and financing a transition. So think about the imperative, this tipping point that we've reached, that this needs to happen. How it happens is a huge opportunity. We're going to have to really invest in new technology, in new ways of doing things. Business models are going to have to change. That is all going to create opportunity and upside. So I think we need to move away from the fear factor, because I think we all know this has to be done, and look at the opportunity that exists. And as a banker, where the money goes makes a difference. And we certainly see this as a significant opportunity to finance a transition, to finance a more sustainable economy and a more long-term economy, and therefore more sustainable businesses and contribution worldwide.
And Alison, I'm just thinking about what you have on your plate right now. I mean, you've got, from the crisis, you've got probably thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of SMEs in debt, who are trying to get through to the other side of the crisis, and they need to pay you back. And on the other hand, you've got a queue probably of people wanting money for new capex and new decarbonisation strategies. So I'm just trying to get clear in my head, are both of those things achievable? Can you both help all the SME customer base through getting back and recovering from the crisis, and at the same time still find finance to help them grow and decarbonise?
Well, the answer is yes. I mean, we benefit from one of the strongest core tier one ratios across all of the European banks at 18.2%. So I have capital that can be deployed to support customers. But the answer is yes, because we have to transition and make sure the opportunity of the rebuild and recovery to make sure that we're addressing these issues. I think the practical steps, particularly for SMEs, are really important. One of the things, exactly as you say, a lot of businesses are dealing with the existential crisis and the effects of the pandemic. Helping them rebuild and recover a more sustainable business and a more sustainable economy means that big businesses like mine, as a leading bank, have to do more to practically help. And that's where I think the collaboration across public and private sector and cross industry is going to be so critical. Us partnering with Microsoft to help SMEs measure emissions is a really important example of us working cross industry to put tools in the hands of people to help them transition. If you're a very large business with big teams, you can do that, but really putting practical steps in place. Green mortgages, so it's cheaper and there are incentives there. We have to have carrot and stick, so to make sure everybody transitions. So the answer is yes, we do have the capacity to do that, to help on one hand, rebuild and recover, businesses rebuild their balance sheet coming out of the pandemic, but also rebuild in a way that is a greener and more sustainable economy. That is an imperative we have to do, but what is critical that we get collaboration across government, globally, public and private sector, to help the smaller businesses who don't have the tools to really transition.
Well, that's incredibly encouraging. Alison, before I let you go, you're gonna kick off the wish list for COP26. We at the B7 this week are just putting the finishing touches to a memorandum which we hand to the Prime Minister and all the G7 political leaders in Cornwall. If you had sort of one ask about what you want to see from COP26 this year, what would it be?
My ask is very clear: collaboration. make sure that we're putting tools in the hands of small businesses and individual companies to make sure that those big global targets translate into practical actions and practical measures so that we can make sure we have a just transition to a low carbon economy.
That's great. Thank you for that. Alistair, just to bring you in, if you could put one thing in the memorandum that we send to governments for COP26, what would it be?
Yeah, I think COP26 is great as an event, but what's really important is what happens after COP26. So we would really like the engagement in partnership for a program post COP26 to really accelerate the transformation to zero carbon. So let's see that vision, that program, and really where the public and private sector can work together.
And Alistair, are you optimistic about that? Do you think we're going to see that?
I am, yes. Actually, I'm very optimistic because, you know, COP26. I know it's just an event, but it's a very unique event because the profile of COP26 has been really accelerated due to the pandemic. It's the first, perhaps, major face-to-face of global leaders. We've seen the political changes in the US. We've seen the commitment from China. We've seen, for once, a major initiative which has got global backing, maybe for the first time. So we cannot waste this opportunity.
I think we're going to be in danger today of building expectations already for COP26. But Francesco, whilst I have you, what would you put in the memo? What do we want G7 leaders to get started on when they meet in a month's time in order to make COP successful?
I think it's a question of time. It all boils down to that. And I would like this COP26 to be all about the next 10 years, what we already have and what we should do, and not a mix of archaeology and science fiction, as it always happens when we talk about the future. You know, there is a mix of things we have, things we had, and things we might have in the future, and everything gets blurred. I think I would really love 26 to focus on the next 10 important years and what it takes to decarbonize in 10 years the maximum possible. Not about the nuclear fission and fusion of 2080, but what about to do now? I think I would like that, and that would be a big success.
I've never heard the phrase before, mix of archaeology and science fiction, but I think it's a pretty interesting description of world affairs. Are you optimistic it will be different this time round?
I am, because I think there is much more consciousness about the importance of time, and I think about the fact that even large think tanks like IEA is making a difference in analyzing what is the next 10 years and what happens after 2030. They have a very clear view of that, and I think that helps.
Dave, I've got an HP laptop in the other room ready to type out the final bits of the communique. What would you like to see in there for COP26?
Yeah, for us, I mean, our ambition at the event is definitely to support our partners, be an active participant in this net zero discussion and help, you know, promote climate goals by being public. I would say if I had one ask, it would be really for governments to do what I've talked about, which is to use the power of the purse, their procurement contracts to get sustainability and climate initiatives into their procurement. This will help drive sustainability globally.
Thank you. Pierre-André, it's been 6 years you've been waiting for us. What are you hoping for?
Well, I hope I'm not too idealistic, but if we could have some concrete progress towards establishing carbon pricing, I think for business, it's probably what's the most needed at the world level.
Well, look, that's a really fantastic panel. Thank you so much. I've written down so many notes. Above all this, there were so many good catchphrases too, but the one that's sticking in my head is that the cost of not doing it is higher than the cost of doing it. And that's a pretty straightforward, granular business sentiment if ever I heard one. Look, thank you to our panel. I mean, I always thought there was something of a tipping point that's building, but when I hear your stories and when I've looked at some of the corporate examples on the Race to Zero on the platform, you can really feel that we're reaching a tipping point. And we've had some real examples and some honesty about the choices right here. So look, to everybody, across the rest of the B7 this week, we'll be discussing these challenges further, exactly the ones we've just heard from the panel. And just to give you all a heads up, we will publish a joint paper from all the B7 delegations on Wednesday, not only an overall communique from the B7, but we'll also have a specific paper on climate change dealing with all the issues that were raised today. In the meantime, if you're not yet signed up for the Race to Zero, you can do it now. You can find out more about how you get involved and what the process is by going to the UN's website. But I'd like to thank the government for working with us in running this session. I'd like to thank our panel, who were fantastic. I'd like to thank Alok. I'd like to thank Patricia. And I'd like to hand back to John Foster to close up this session at today's B7 CEO Summit. John.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tony, and thank you also to our brilliant panel. I've got no doubt that we will build on the conversations today in the run-up to COP26. Colleagues, we're now going to take a very short 30-minute break. When